Hello and welcome to this roundtable discussion organized by the International Relations Cluster. In today's roundtable, we will be discussing the impact on India of the 47th G7 summit, which was held in Cornwall, United Kingdom from 11 to 13 June. The G7 is an organization of the world's 7 largest socially advanced economies. Its members include the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Canada, Italy, and Japan. Ever since its formation in 1973, the grouping has been in a position to influence political responses to global challenges because of its significant wealth and power. The group holds annual summits that provide a platform that can shape these political responses, and its actions have directly contributed to lifting millions out of poverty and promoting democracy around the world. In recent years, as Asian economies have begun to rise, the group's ability to achieve meaningful economic coordination has been surpassed by that of more comprehensive groupings like the G20. And at times, it has even been questioned. Nevertheless, the G7 still continues to retain considerable influence. There is perhaps no better indicator of the G7's prowess than its ability to in taking the lead to reinitiate in-person or handshake diplomacy in the post-pandemic age. A mean feat, given that 87% of the world's population, and largely from low-income nations, is still unvaccinated. In the context of a rising and belligerent China and the gradual backsliding of democracy across the world, India has grown increasingly important to the group as a partner over the past couple of years, and that too the past couple of decades, when we think about it. During Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh's tenure between 2004 and 2014, India attended the G8 summit 5 times, and the recently held summit was the second time under the tenure of current Prime Minister Narendra Modi that India had been invited to the event. The recently concluded summit was especially significant as the agreements reached during it, namely a commitment to deliver 1 billion vaccines, a global minimum corporate tax, infrastructural investment, and a stronger stance against authoritarianism, are all of great consequence in the shaping of the post-pandemic world order. Today, we will be discussing how the agreements emerging from the summit specifically impact India and the geopolitical and economic role it is likely to play. Allow me to introduce you to the panelists for today's discussion. I am Karthike, and I will be facilitating this discussion along with Dipanshu. We have with us Sagara and Yashasvi, and Neeraja from the IR cluster helped us prepare the discussion points. We're looking forward to everyone's insights, and hopefully this will make for an enriching discussion.
Thank you, Karthikeya, for that very comprehensive introduction of the topic today. So let's begin with the specific outcomes of the summit and what implications those are likely to have for India. At the G7 summit, the leaders pledged to phase out the coal-fired power generation and end funding for new coal-burning power plants in the developing world. The group has collectively agreed to net zero GHG, that is greenhouse gas emissions, by 2050, and even made official development assistance, also known as the ODA, to developing partners conditional upon achieving significant cuts in the 2020s and net zero by 2050. Now, despite a strong push towards renewable energy resources in the recent years, India remains heavily dependent on coal. In fact, a Niti Aayog report from 2017 observed that India's reliance on coal could continue beyond 2047. Inevitably, any attempt to achieve significant cuts in the current decade will mean India would face a thermal power crunch over the next few years. It's been just over a couple of months since the summit ended, and there are important questions about whether the discussions at the summit have led to particular modes of actions that India could employ to tackle its energy issue.
Hi, so may I begin? Yeah. So, well, I am pretty glad to see all the renewed interest in investing in clean energy in India, especially because international investors have outlined India as one of the prime locations for investments in renewable energy. So it's all very cool and good that there's a lot more attention being given towards renewable energy. However, there's going to be a lot more things to deal with if India wants to really effectively transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And two of the main issues that I find, which I don't think has been seriously addressed enough by the G7 summit, is firstly the inherent contradictions in India's own policy. So for one, India has asked for low-cost installations of renewable energy sources under Prime Minister Modi's initiatives. But at the same time, this is directly clashing with Prime Minister Modi's Make in India campaign, which essentially adds import duties on anything that is produced abroad. So there is an inherent contradiction there, which could slow down the process of installing these renewable energy sources. And slowing down installations is the last thing we want, because just like it was mentioned in the question, India's dependence on coal is increasing, and it is even expected to triple by 2040. So the pace at which these installations need to happen in order to actually successfully transfer away from fossil fuels needs to happen a lot faster. And if these institutional problems continue to come up, and if these policies continue to clash with each other, that may become a hurdle in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, roughly a month ago, there have been a couple of important developments with regards to the adoption of renewable energy in India. Well, roughly a month ago, Reliance Industries, which operates the world's largest crude oil refining complex, announced plans to invest close to 750 billion rupees. That's like $10 billion in clean energy over the next 3 years, starting from now. And that would help pave way for a crucial transformation, as investors, consumers, and governments world over would seek sustainable growth. And later on July 9th, I believe, it was reported that the Canadian pension fund OMERS and the Norwegian state-funded investment fund Nordfund are in talks to buy a 20% stake in Avada Energy, which is an Indian solar project developer. Now, it's clear that any push towards rapid adoption of renewable energy, especially in countries like India, where the industry is still at its nascent stages and does require extensive international investment, is contingent on how conducive India would be to business, how conducive and business environment India would be. And it becomes important to discuss whether that regulatory environment would be welcoming of such investments. And that brings us to the second question. Now, after receiving support from all G7 members of the Cornwall summit, the new proposed 15% tax rate on corporations has also been received positively at the recent OECD and G20 meetings. And India is estimated to gain at least 30,000 crore rupees as a result of the proposed rules, which is equivalent to 6% of our corporate tax collections alone the previous fiscal year. But it has also expressed some reservations with the proposed profit allocation and the scope of the rules as it was outlined at the summit. And we've been thinking about what the specifics of these contentions are and how are they being addressed by the parties.
So, like you mentioned, India is on track to gain a lot, but one of the potential drawbacks that comes to mind are multinationals. Multinationals are a source of foreign direct investment. These corporations often help generate demand with efficient utilization of resources and create employment in low-income countries such as India. One potential drawback is that the global minimum tax rate will finish off every opportunity for such countries whose only weapon to attract these companies is lower taxes. India already has been engaging greatly with foreign governments in double taxation avoidance agreements, tax information exchange agreements, and multilateral conventions to plug loopholes. This proposal of a common tax rate thereby adds no further benefits to India. A lower tax rate is a tool for India to alternatively push economic activity. If the proposal actually comes into effect, India may experience a longer economic hangover than other developed nations with less ability to offer mega stimulus packages. However, this might affect a few other countries. Currently, India's effective tax rate is still above the global minimum tax rate that is being suggested, and it is believed that it would not impact companies doing business currently in India. The global minimum tax rate impacts countries using low tax jurisdiction to achieve low global tax cost. Moreover, India attracts foreign investment not just because of its attractive tax rates, but also its large internal market, quality labor at competitive rates, strategic location for exports, and a thriving private sector. Additionally, we also have received support from other partners such as Deloitte India, Rohinton Sidhwa. He said that the benefit of the minimum tax rate should accrue by first giving a right to tax a slice of profit of the large global digital MNEs. Secondly, it will also put an end to the various digital taxes that have proliferated around the world, similar to the equalization levy in India. Lastly, he also believes that it paves the way for the changes in global tax treaties that are pursuant to the consensus being reached. Hence, the only two things that I believe we need to plan for are the tax avoidance, which forms a troubling issue for the global economy and especially in a country that is structured like India. And secondly, how will the allocation of revenue occur between the market countries involved?
Does anyone have anything to add to that? Yes,
Yeah.
Sagra, go ahead.
Yeah, so continuing off of what Yashasvi had said about how cutting tax rates may not exactly be very beneficial for the Indian economy, there's actually proof of that, because in 2019, India did cut the corporate tax rate from 30% to 22%, I believe. And all it did was reduce state revenues without, significantly increasing economic growth. So that is already a precursor in terms of the performance that India has seen with tax cuts to the corporations. So it remains to be seen whether further tax cuts will do much in terms of helping to boost the sector. And another issue is that Yashasvi had mentioned that the Deloitte partner mentioned the one benefit that could come from the corporate minimum tax is if we are able to levy those taxes on digital MNEs. But one of the main issues is that as it stands today, the global minimum corporate tax has no clarification on whether or not countries can continue to levy those taxes on digital sectors. So in the past, US has been pretty vocal about opposing India's equalization levy, which is called, I think, the Google tax. So it's pretty clear that the US is not in support of taxing digital tech companies because they believe that it's discriminatory to US companies. But at least for India, it's very important to continue to be able to levy those taxes on these tech giants because they're making billions of dollars of revenue in India and paying very little for it. And another issue with the corporate minimum tax is that it's levied on profits, I believe. But these tech giants, on paper, their profits could be recorded as zero, where their revenues may be in the billions, which is why the equalization levy is levied on the revenues of these companies and not their profits. So there needs to be more clarification with regards to that. And as long as there isn't, India needs to be very cautiously optimistic when engaging with the global corporate minimum tax. Yeah.
I also do have something to add to what Sagra and Yashasvi pointed out. I really like that line that Sagra said towards the end, that India needs to be cautiously optimistic about engagement with the global minimum tax. However, I do have like a slightly optimistic kind of point of view to present towards this, because my basically the essence is that right now, as you mentioned, that India has a corporate minimum tax of around 22%. So what in my opinion this does is, the global minimum tax does is, it ends the race to the bottom. And doing that, the countries which are more quote unquote economically developed and have that kind of margins that they can levy lesser tax and still gain a lot of FDI, will be prevented, that will be cut. And with that, what can happen is, we can also, some reports say that we can also see some reverse investment into India. So countries which have the shell corporations which have had their like profits booked outside India could come back, because now the tax regime is equal for all. So, and it will also drastically reduce spending into these tax havens of sorts, which virtually like have 0% corporate taxes. And it can also bring a lot of reverse funding into the country. And secondly, I personally feel that austerity measures, which certain economists tend to kind of suggest by having higher tax rates, might not be the way to go, because historically we have seen that India has flourished the most when we were kind of open to the world. So I think the real question over here is, now with a competitive corporate tax of 15%, let's say, India, first of all, India need not reduce it directly. immediately, right? Because it needs to kind of have a lot of calculations with respect to the other developing nations in the Southeast and South Asian region. And even if it does, I think the main question that India needs to ask is how to attract that kind of FDI, and that could be by developing its manufacturing and services sector very directly. So if you pump money into it and show it to the global like companies that okay, India offers good manufacturing tech, like manufacturing services and that infrastructure, then definitely like companies will be attracted to India because of what, yes, as we also mentioned, that we have a strategic location and in terms of global trade, and we have a good, healthy, up and coming private sector. So yeah, that's so. This brings me to my next question about the G7's agreement to support the BRI rivaling Build Back Better World, or also known as B3W initiative, a project to invest over $40 trillion to address the developing world's infrastructural needs. Uh, it was one of the most important outcomes of the Cornwall summit, and experts have already pointed out that as a multi-nation project and being one of a group of noisy democracies, the B3W would face much more scrutiny and delays due to institutional limits, which is fair. But there are also questions over its financial viability and geopolitical impact, especially as the project would be in direct contention with China's BRI, also known as the Belt and Road Initiative, in certain locations. So, how do you think participating countries plan to address these concerns, and how do you see India contributing? Specifically, what does the B3W mean for India's connectivity with its South Asian neighbors?
Well, I think it's true that the B3W will obviously face much more scrutiny and delays due to institutional limits. Needless to say, this is because the B3W is not a mere copy of the Belt and Road Initiative, which has largely proven to be a front for China's debt trap diplomacy. What makes the B3W harder to execute is the fact that it is a coordinated effort, while the BRI is solely controlled and executed by the Chinese state. Most likely, the B3W will require creating new institutions, and the institutions which plan and execute these projects, and others which will oversee them and their fairness. And when we compare the B3W and the BRI, it's also important to recognize the fact that many countries choose to host BRI projects not just because of a lack of funding options or China's coercion, but because these projects allow them to exert greater control over their own ventures and allow the governments in power to amass greater political legitimacy. So around a month ago, Dr. Alvin Camba, a professor at the University of Denver, published his study on the Philippines, which revealed that the Philippines' president, Rodrigo Duterte, had allowed Chinese authorities to develop two major projects in the country, a dam and an irrigation system. The names, I'm afraid I'm unable to remember, and this happened even while the Japanese government was willing to fund them, and that too at a lower interest rate. According to Camba's research, Duterte personally chose China because Chinese officials had assured him that his government that these projects would be completed during his term, which would end in 2022. This way, Duterte would be able to leverage both projects to maximize his political clout and gather support before the 2022 general election, while the burden of repaying China would go to his successors. So in some cases, the BRI is as much a political tool for host nations as it is for China to spread its influence. And this is something that the G7 will have to reckon with, and as they plan to execute all these B3W projects. As for India could contribute and what it means for regional connectivity in South Asia, it's still not very clear how that would go on ahead. Bangladesh and Sri Lanka are, of course, natural partners because ties with them still have been on the better, they have been improving despite the frictions. And Sri Lanka is one of the countries which has actually shown interest in participating in the B3W in statements over the past couple of months. But there is, there's still the problem of India having to come to terms with its own ongoing infrastructural projects, some of which are way behind schedule, and taking on similar projects while leaving all these other commitment aside. That's a diplomatic that would be something really hard to navigate for us. And Yeah, at the time of recording, the US Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, is visiting India, and a plan for India's involvement in the B3W is one of the agendas of discussion. And it would be interesting to see how that pans out and what comes out of that discussion.
I have one contention with what Karthikeya said. The China's BRI may not exactly be a tool for their debt trap diplomacy because it has been very widely dismissed as a myth. But regardless of whether or not the theory is like true in reality, the fact of the matter is that it has been blown out of proportion by the media so much that it has become enough of a concern for the countries that are actually involved in the BRI especially because of the lack of transparency around the BRI loans that have been issued to these countries. So that's where the Build Back Better World initiative comes in. Like that's where it offers a better, safer, more transparent alternative to the BRI to these nations. But then at the same time, the place where the Build Back Better World initiative may not be as attractive to these countries is because it's completely based on private funding. So while the Chinese state, just like you said, Karthikeya, is completely responsible for the BRI, the weakness of the BRI is that it has no overarching institutionalization. It's like spread out over all different public and private sector banks. So while it is a weakness of the BRI, it has turned out to be a strength for these individual countries because they can choose which investor they want to get the loans from. They don't have the same option for the Build Back Better World initiative because they are working on a more coordinated effort, just like Karthikeya said, and they're also working on purely private investment. And the issue with that is that they're going to seek projects in countries that are actually actively profitable and actively promoted by the market. And one of the main benefits of the BRI is that the Chinese loans are being given out to countries that even have really horrible credit ratings. So countries that have almost no profitability are still getting loans from the BRI purely because of them being allies to China. So that is something that I don't think the Build Back Better World initiative can replace, because inherently, due to the fact that it is relying on private investment, it is unlikely that these low-income countries will get any kind of investment from this initiative, as opposed to the BRI, which is lending a huge amount of money to them at the risk of them, being considered a debt trap. So yeah, that is one area where the Build Back Better World may not actually be able to replace the BRI. And as for where India stands, India has naturally been very suspicious of the BRI. In fact, the whole debt trap diplomacy theory, it originated in India. So it's natural that India would be an ally that the US authorities would seek when wanting to establish more projects related to the Build Back Better initiative in South Asia. As for how that will play out, yeah, we'll have to wait and see. Yeah.
I do have a response to Sagra's very interesting points. One is that I feel I totally agree that B3W will have some kind of difficulty because of I think it'll have some kind of difficulty because it is involving these private sector firms and banks to invest. Because when you talk about BRI, you mainly think of two things. It's Chinese investments, and that too Chinese state-owned enterprises coming in and kind of building your works, building those buildings in Cambodia, or building those bridges in Africa, and like building the port in Hambantota. So it's more state controlled, and that is why institutions, I think, play a very important role, because when you start floating out tenders for this, then it gets messy. Otherwise, if it's like state allocated, it's still better. But yeah, that's a very ideal thing to talk about perfect allocation, and that's, I think, a different issue. But another thing that I feel about the B3W is that it's more laudatory, and there will definitely be a problem of coordination, because even if you see these G7 countries, they might not converge on a particular topic, on particular investments, and then it'll get difficult, and then there'll be tough questions to answer. So even though it'll definitely be more transparent than the BRI, and the risk of the debt trap will be lesser, but still alarm bells around neocolonialism and these investments and debt trap lie with the US as much as with China. India intuitively, I feel, would be willing to get the benefits of the out of B3W rather than investing money into it, because definitely India needs some kind of structural investments into infrastructure and all. And also, my part of my point is motivated from India's behavior on our side. When India is not so ready to invest into South and Southeast Asian countries already through RCEP, which will definitely kind of boost its own economy as well. I'm not very sure if India will want to kind of pour out money into infrastructural projects which are already at a disadvantage, I would say, in especially the neighborhood when compared to BRI. So yeah, I am not really optimistic about that.
Yeah, if I may, I like your point about how the BTW may be perceived as a neo-colonialist initiative, because that's another major reason why these nations are so willing to stick to BRI, even under the threat of getting stuck in a debt trap, right? Because they have the history of dealing with the IMF and dealing with the World Bank, and they have the history of being forced to introduce reforms that they were never interested in purely because they were stuck in these loans that they could not repay. So what China did through the BRI was basically offer them an alternative where they could get an immense amount of money for infrastructure investments, and at the same time not worry too much about paying them back, because China has engaged in debt relief in a lot of these countries that are at high risk of debt distress. So they have the money, but they don't have too much worry about how they'll pay it back or whether they will be coerced into something. In a few cases where there have been so-called evidences of them, giving out some of their assets to China, have all happened because of their own distress that has come from Western financial institutions. So, for example, in the case of Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port was given to China because they needed the money to pay back some of the loans that they'd taken from Western capital markets. So the fear of falling under those neo-colonialist traps that they've experienced in the past may definitely deter these countries from engaging with the Build Back Better World initiative.
Those are all very valid points. Another thing which struck me while you were having that discussion was the fact that with institutions you have a lot more accountability, and that is something that the B3W, by virtue of being a collaborative project, promises. And again, it is something that the BRI has often lacked. And labor-related issues are something that are often not at the fore a lot when we discuss the BRI, and that is something that has been taken really seriously at the G7 summit. So US President Joe Biden and other G7 leaders, quote, remain deeply concerned by the use of all forms of forced labor in global supply chains, including state-sponsored forced labor of vulnerable groups and minorities, and supply chains of the agricultural, solar, and garment sectors. The main supply chains of concern are, of course, Xinjiang in China. And most G7 leaders have outright called China for their use of forced labor inside the nation and outside too. And yeah, Biden has specifically requested all G7 leaders to form a united argument against China's use of forced labor. And although others have shown a lack of interest in this matter, if a consensus is reached, what would the economic repercussions be? And that is something we've been thinking about for a long time, but we don't really have a clear answer to. And would you have a comment on that?
So the easiest way to do is conduct a short cost-benefit analysis on forced labor. Now, forced labor obviously has its direct economic benefits. Firms that use slave labor save a lot of money on wages, thus directly lowering their production costs and increasing the value added per product. Similarly, companies also reduce their costs by not being liable anymore for the provision of entitlements, severance pay, and any other benefits that are often afforded to salaried workers. Having indentured labor force is especially useful to these firms in highly volatile markets because it makes the producer very resilient in the face of any demand spikes that may occur. By foregoing such forms of modern slavery, companies will no longer be able to benefit from these very obvious cost reduction techniques. However, contrary to the popular belief, forced labor is costly as well, especially in the social aspects that we'll see. Firms bear the cost of suboptimal productivity as these workers are simply not incentivized to work harder than the absolute minimum because they have no risk aversion to losses. Forced labor generates limited investment in human capital of the country. Forced labor is often associated with labor intensive production requiring very low skilled workers. An economy running simply on this kind of labor is expected to stagnate at the lowest end of the production ladder in the basic or the primary activities with very little added value. The government is also not able to collect any form of tax revenue from the income that is paid to this labor. As slaves have a limited or non-existing purchasing power, forced labor takes away the revenues that a state and a local economy would otherwise have gained through taxes and consumption of these free workers. Moreover, assuming that forced labor is illegal, the corruption that goes together with frequently incurs considerable cost to the states. For example, again, through tax avoidance, corrupt public contracting. Hence, in my opinion, the shift to ethical and legal workforce may cause a short-term increase in costs. However, in the long run, it will be more beneficial for the development of not only individuals who are forced into this kind of labor, but firms and the country itself. I do believe that this shift will lead to a more holistic development of all three groups of people.
All fair points. Would anyone have anything to add to what Yashasvi said?
Yeah, so
I do.
sorry. The economic benefits of shifting to ethical labor are, obvious, but then they have to be put in context of the larger political arena, right? So right now, under President Biden, the US has started decoupling over this Xinjiang issue in China, and this has already started hurting a lot of US companies. But, as Yashasvi said, this may be a very short-term cost. But the issue with this is that more than it hurts the US, it's going to hurt the Chinese industries. And China is eventually going to retaliate. I mean, as it is already, there is an impression that Biden's retaliation over Xinjiang is just a continuation of Trump's war, basically, the Cold War that he had started with China. Over import duties and so on and so forth. So this is just going to be a part 2 of that war if Biden continues to pursue policies against China because of the Xinjiang issue. So despite the economic benefits that could come with shifting away from forced labor in Xinjiang, the consequences of acting on that incentive, at least the political consequences, may cause more problems in the long run than benefits, I think, just because of the way that China will retaliate to these actions.
Dipanshu, go ahead.
Yeah, I think those points are fairly valid, and I do understand the ethical and the moral compass that often Western democracies base themselves from. But I think they're also on the outside. They may say all of these things, but this is also, as Sagra pointed out, has a very nuanced political calculus behind it. And I apologize for being so pessimistic about this situation, but I think reality shows points us in a different direction, because again, US did call, and Biden recently did say that the US will stop its trade on goods from Xinjiang, but that will have a huge economic impact on not just the US and China, but other countries also if they follow suit. And while I agree that that would be looked at as a more short-term cost, but I just have one question in my mind which keeps on troubling me, that the forced labor that we have in Xinjiang regions and that entire Uyghur Muslim population, even though atrocities are committed against them, the Arab world, not necessarily just the Arab world, but the Central Asian countries and the Muslim Islamic republics, basically, they have remained silent over the issue. They have not publicly called out China on that or stopped the trade. So there might be very nuanced political reasons behind that, which one must look at before trying to jump at ethical conclusions derived based out of ethical conundrums, which might tend to put up a very bright picture of the world about what ought to be done, but might not be the reality. Now, with regards to India, I feel I covered this in another podcast at the center itself, that India has somewhat of a paranoia from time to time with regards to China and Chinese trade. And we've all heard, the slogans going out that, okay, ban trade with China, don't trade with China, stop all Chinese good, people coming out on roads and burning Chinese good. But we need to realize how intrinsically deep we have, like how Chinese goods have are there in the Indian economy, how deep they have penetrated the Indian economy, that it's not just like easy to get rid of them. And secondly, another thing that is China is moving from FMCG manufacturing to tech manufacturing, which is often which then often rooted through from the Silicon Valley. That's also really China is kind of revolutionizing its economy and kind of shifting gears now, high industry. And yeah,
Just like
Sure, go ahead.
I would just like to add a point that Anshu spoke about the morals that these Western nations face themselves. Sometimes when you dig deeper, faceless. Because the Global Slavery Index 28 estimates that are given 2006, there were almost 400,000 people living in conditions of modern slavery in the United States, which comes down to 1.3 victims of modern slavery for every 1,000 in the country. In fact, the United States, multiple government agencies don't even provide a definitive set of statistics on identified victims. This really makes me think how open is United States to other countries who would want to understand the condition of worker rights and labor rights in their own country as well. And it also makes this entire thing seem like a fishing expedition and the Trump's Cold War against China, when you yourself aren't looking to introspect at your workers and the condition of your labor in your own country.
Yeah, I think that sums up pretty well what I was about to say. And I mean, just as an add-on, given like when we look at labor laws alongside, upcoming projects like the B3W, I think we have a tendency to antagonize, given the various national narratives, how a certain country should behave. And well, this is just how the world works. We're very interconnected, and the point is not to isolate China. I think that's what is understood broadly, but rather to, let's say, limit our dependence on its global supply chains. So I think if the B3W were to move in a more sustainable direction, if should it choose to, it would be important to note that the objective is not to obliterate a particular country or its economy, but rather to make it a more acceptable member of the world order, which does not stir up conflicts. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this discussion. Thank you all for your participation. It was really interesting to listen to your perspectives and observations on the topic. And many thanks to our viewers. We hope you enjoyed listening to this roundtable discussion.